What I'm dealing with is hard because it involves more than just my heart. It involves a lot of little hearts. You know, we have 4 kids, and divorce is never easy. And we're both from divorced families.
There are stories that the public thinks they already know. They have read the headlines, scrolled for the court filings, watched the television interviews, and somewhere along the way convinced themselves they have the complete picture. But the story of Kelly Clarkson and Brandon Blackstock was never fully told in public. What the world witnessed was a carefully curated version of a marriage. The red carpet appearances, the affectionate social media posts, the glowing words in magazine spreads. What remained hidden was everything unfolding behind closed doors. The real dynamics, the quiet suffering, the slow erosion of a partnership that looked, from the outside, like everything a person could want. This is the story of what truly happened, and why it took so long for the full truth to finally surface. To understand the depth of what Kelly went through in her marriage, you first have to understand where she started. Kelly Clarkson did not grow up surrounded by examples of stable, lasting love. Her father, Stephen Michael Clarkson, walked out on the family when Kelly was just 6 years old. That early abandonment didn't simply leave a scar. It fundamentally shaped how she understood love, relationships, and her own worth. Children who are left by a parent don't always consciously carry that wound into adulthood, but it shapes their choices in ways that are impossible to fully see until much later in life. The longing to be loved unconditionally, to be chosen without condition, becomes the invisible force driving almost every major decision they make. When Kelly burst onto the national stage in 2002 as the first ever winner of American Idol, she seemed like pure joy made visible. She won with 58% of the public vote at the Kodak Theater, and within weeks her debut single had shattered a 38-year-old chart record previously held by the Beatles, leaping from number 52 all the way to number 1 on the Billboard Hot 100. The entire country fell in love with her almost instantly. She was unfiltered, warm, impossibly talented, and completely genuine at a time when the entertainment industry rewarded polish over authenticity. Nobody who watched her that night could have imagined the private battles that were quietly waiting for her down the road. But underneath all that brightness lived a young woman who had spent her childhood quietly longing to feel chosen, to feel like she was worth staying for. Her music, even in its most empowering moments, carried that undercurrent. Songs about independence, about moving on, about surviving heartbreak. They sounded like anthems to millions of listeners. But Kelly herself has acknowledged over the years that they were also a kind of armor, built layer by layer from years of learning to protect herself from pain she couldn't prevent. When you grow up believing that love can be withdrawn without warning, you learn to perform strength even when you are quietly breaking apart on the inside. Her 2015 song, Piece by Piece, laid that history bare with devastating honesty. It told the story of a father who walked away and never came back, and it drew a direct contrast between that abandonment and the love she believed she had found in her marriage. It was one of the most emotionally unguarded moments of her entire career. Millions of people cried alongside her because the feeling she was singing about, the desperate, lifelong hunger to finally be loved the way you deserved, was something so many people understood from their own lives. What made it painful to look back on was the realization that even as she sang those words with such raw conviction, the marriage she was celebrating was already carrying cracks that were invisible to everyone except those living inside it. Kelly first crossed paths with Brandon Blackstock in 2006 during rehearsals for the Academy of Country Music Awards. He was working as a talent manager, moving through the country music world on the strength of family connections. His father, Brandon Blackstock, had long managed the career of Reba McEntire. Their first meeting was brief and professionally unremarkable. 2 busy people passing through the same space at the same moment. Nothing came of it at the time, and neither of them could have predicted what would eventually unfold between them. When they reconnected years later, the dynamic was entirely different. The chemistry between them was real and immediate. Brandon was confident, charming, and he had a quality that Kelly found deeply compelling. He seemed to genuinely see her, not the famous singer, not the competition winner, not the carefully constructed public image, but the actual person underneath all of it. For someone who had spent so much of her life either feeling invisible or being reduced to her celebrity, that quality was more powerful than almost anything else could have been. He made her feel, for the first time in a long time, like she was enough. By December 2012, Brandon had proposed. Kelly said yes without hesitation. They married in October 2013, blending their families from the very beginning. Brandon had 2 children from a previous relationship, and Kelly and Brandon went on to welcome 2 children of their own, daughter River Rose, born in 2014, and son Remington Alexander, born in 2016. From every visible angle, the picture looked beautiful and complete. The woman who had grown up without a stable, loving home had built one of her own. The girl who had been abandoned was now surrounded by family. To everyone watching from the outside, it seemed like exactly the ending her story had always deserved. Except it was not an ending. It was only the beginning of a different and more private kind of pain. Marriages rarely collapse all at once. They thin out gradually, weakening along fault lines that are easy to miss until the whole structure finally gives way. That is precisely what happened between Kelly and Brandon. The deterioration was slow, cumulative, and largely invisible to the outside world because Kelly, protected by nature, private by necessity, kept it that way for a very long time. She had spent her whole life learning to hold difficult things quietly, and she applied that same instinct to the slow unraveling of her marriage. What she has shared in the years since the divorce proceedings began paints a portrait of deep and persistent loneliness. Not the occasional loneliness that visits any busy person from time to time, but a grinding, chronic solitude that existed right in the center of her marriage. She has described feeling like a single mother long before she legally became one. The partnership she had envisioned, the one she had sung about with such genuine emotion, the one she had believed in completely, was not the reality she was living day to day. She was carrying the household. She was a primary parent. She was managing her career, her public obligations, and her emotional well-being largely on her own, while simultaneously trying to maintain the outward appearance that everything was functioning well. The situation was made significantly more complicated by something that rarely receives direct attention in the coverage of this story. Brandon was not only Kelly's husband, he was also entangled in her professional life. The boundary between personal partnership and business management had blurred in ways that created a power imbalance she struggled to fully recognize while she was living inside it. When the person who holds influence over your career is also the person you share a home and a bed with, the ordinary mechanisms for holding someone accountable, asking the hard questions, pushing back, insisting on clarity, become far more difficult to access. Kelly was navigating that complexity entirely in private, without the outside perspective that might have helped her see what was really happening much sooner. Financial disputes that came to the surface once the divorce proceedings began confirmed what the texture of the marriage had quietly been suggesting for years. Serious questions arose about management commissions, about how Kelly's substantial earnings had been handled, and about arrangements that she may not have fully understood or clearly agreed to. These were not minor disagreements over accounting details. They were fundamental questions about who had been benefiting from Kelly's extraordinary professional success, and to what degree, and under what circumstances. The answers that emerged through the legal process were not flattering to Brandon. Kelly filed for divorce in June 2020, citing irreconcilable differences. That phrase carries none of the true weight of what it represents in a situation like this one. Irreconcilable differences means years of trying and failing. It means the quiet, exhausting death of something you desperately wanted to preserve. It means reaching the point where the distance between the marriage you had believed in and the marriage you were actually living had grown too wide to bridge, no matter how much effort you continue to pour into it. For Kelly, who had spent her entire life trying to hold things together, making that decision represented an enormous and painful act of self-honesty. What followed was not a clean or simple break. It became a prolonged and complicated legal battle that reached into every corner of their shared life: spousal support, custody of their young children, property division, management fee disputes. Each issue demanded that Kelly fight, not on a stage with a microphone in her hand, but in conference rooms and courtrooms, through attorneys and formal filings, across months that gradually stretched into years. It was grinding, exhausting work, and she did most of it while simultaneously maintaining her career, raising her children, and managing a public persona that gave very little outward indication of how difficult things had become. The Montana ranch became the most publicly contested point in the entire proceeding. Kelly had invested enormous amounts of money and emotional energy into that property. It represented something genuinely precious to her, a place of peace, of quiet, of privacy away from the relentless demands of her public life. Brandon contested ownership of the ranch in the divorce. The court ultimately ruled in Kelly's favor, determining that it belonged to her alone. But even after that ruling was handed down, Brandon remained on the property for an extended period of time, requiring a separate court order directing him to vacate by June 2022. Even in the aftermath of a legal defeat, the situation continued to require Kelly to push, to persist, and to insist on what was rightfully hers. In November 2020, the court awarded Kelly primary custody of River and Remington. It was the outcome that mattered most to her, not as a legal victory to be celebrated, but as the assurance that her children would be stable and consistently cared for by the parent who had, by every available measure, been doing that work throughout the entirety of a marriage. In February 2022, Kelly took a step that was quietly radical in a way that the public did not fully grasp at the time. She legally changed her name to Kelly Brianne. Professionally, Kelly Clarkson would remain, but legally, she was reclaiming herself, shedding a surname tangled up with her father's early abandonment and deliberately stepping away from the identity she had worn through years of a marriage that had cost her so much. It was not a dramatic public gesture. It was a private act of self-reclamation, a quiet, deliberate insistence that she belonged to herself first, before she belonged to anyone else's story. The narrative around Brandon Blackstock in the press was, for a long time, relatively restrained. He was Kelly's husband, the father of her children, a man from a well-connected industry family. The more uncomfortable details emerged slowly through court documents and financial disclosures that most people never read in detail. What those documents revealed was a picture of a man who had been comfortable allowing Kelly to shoulder the full weight of their shared life while positioning himself to benefit materially from her success. The management disputes alone raised serious questions about how their professional arrangement had actually functioned, and whether Kelly had clearly understood at the time she agreed to them what those arrangements truly meant. The behavior around the ranch told its own story about character. Contesting ownership of a property the court ultimately determined was not yours, and then remaining on that property after the ruling, suggests someone unwilling to accept limits even after those limits have been formally and legally established. Kelly had to keep fighting long after most people assumed the fighting was done. What Kelly has acknowledged carefully and in measured terms is that the imbalance she experienced in the marriage was not accidental. It had been built into the structure of the relationship over years, in ways she could not see clearly while she was in the middle of it. The person who had once made her feel genuinely chosen had gradually shifted into a position where her effort, creative, financial, emotional, parental, was carrying a life that he was significantly less invested in maintaining. It took her years to see that clearly, and more years to find the courage to act on what she finally understood. Nobody outside the marriage saw any of this clearly for a long time, not because the evidence wasn't accumulating, but because Kelly continued to protect it. She spoke warmly about Brandon in public long after the marriage had started coming apart internally. She continued to present the family as a stable unit. She did this partly out of genuine love for what the relationship had once been, and partly out of the same deeply ingrained instinct she had carried since childhood, the instinct to hold things together, to not let the cracks become visible, to keep performing wholeness even when you are privately falling apart. The measure of a person is not what they lose. It is what they choose to do in the aftermath of losing it. And by that measure, everything Kelly has done since the divorce began stands as remarkable evidence of her character. Her 10th studio album, Chemistry, released in June 2023, is by widespread critical agreement one of the most honest and powerful records of her entire career. It does not rush toward recovery. It does not perform healing before healing has actually taken place. It sits honestly inside the messy, unresolved feelings of love that mattered deeply and ended painfully, and it refuses to offer a tidy resolution that the experience did not actually provide. Critics recognize it immediately as a work of genuine artistic courage, because making it required Kelly to return to the pain, sit inside it long enough to understand it, and then find language worthy of what she had survived. Even her sense of humor came through the other side intact. During the holiday season following the divorce, she released a Christmas-themed visualizer showing 4 stockings, one for herself, 2 for her children, and 1 labeled simply Nope. It was funny and sharp and said everything it needed to say without a single word of explanation. It told the world, in the most Kelly Clarkson way imaginable, that she had found solid ground again. Her move to New York City in 2023 to film the 5th season of The Kelly Clarkson Show was another kind of statement. New York does not ask about your past. It keeps moving, and Kelly moved with it. On screen, she was as warm, present, and genuinely connected as ever. Behind the scenes, she was doing the quiet, unglamorous work of rebuilding from scratch, establishing new routines, creating new stability for her children, slowly figuring out who she was on the other side of something that had changed her in ways she was still in the process of understanding. Kelly has been careful and measured about what she says publicly regarding Brandon, and that carefulness is itself a form of grace. Her children will grow up and eventually read what their mother said about their father, and she is already thinking about that future. There are things she will not expose, not because she has run out of things to say, but because her children's well-being will always come before her own need for the record to be fully set straight. But she has said enough, in interviews, in music, in unguarded moments of candor that slip through the careful management of her public image. She has made the shape of the truth visible to anyone paying close enough attention. The marriage was not simply 2 people who grew apart over time. It was a situation that required Kelly to carry far more than her share, for far longer than anyone on the outside realized, while someone else benefited quietly from the weight she was bearing. It exploited her loyalty and her childhood-forged need to hold things together at almost any personal cost. And it took years of suffering, of trying, of slowly accumulating clarity, before she was finally ready and able to act on what she understood. What she wants people to take from all of this is not sympathy and not outrage on her behalf. What she wants people to understand is something far more important than either of those responses. Harm does not always arrive loudly. It does not always come with raised voices or obvious, undeniable cruelty. Sometimes it comes quietly, in the form of sustained absence disguised as busyness, in the form of financial arrangements that drift out of balance, so gradually that by the time you notice, years have already passed, in the form of a partner who is physically present enough to maintain appearances, but never truly there enough to actually share the life you are building, in the form of realizing, slowly and then all at once, that the loneliness you've been carrying for years is not a temporary phase. It is a fundamental truth of what your relationship has become, and choosing to leave, not just imagining it, not just threatening it, but actually making a decision and then fighting every single battle that follows, is not failure. It never was. It is the most deliberate and difficult act of self-respect that a person can perform. It is the moment when you stop waiting for someone else to finally choose you, and you choose yourself instead. Kelly Clarkson made that choice. She fought for her children, fought for her property, fought for her finances, and fought for her own dignity across years of a legal and emotional battle that would have broken someone less resilient. And everything she has built on the other side of it, the music, the television show, the life she is making in New York with her children at the center of everything, is the clearest possible evidence that she was right to do so.